There you go. This is going to be a part of the series I mentioned. It's going to be a glitch in it because of the school of worship that we're running weekly here, in addition to the regular services. In a couple of weeks, it'll throw off a little. But I'm talking about the Torah. In the last 2 weeks, I showed you Messiah in the Torah. How do you see Yeshua in the Torah? That took a couple of weeks. I could have taken like a few more hours to do that, but we rushed through it. But I'm going to lay down a foundation. Why did God give the Mosaic Torah? When I say Torah in this series, I'm talking about the Mosaic Torah, the first 5 books. That is the basis of understanding of the culture of biblical people who pay attention to the whole Bible. And it's a foundation for everything that came after that, all the way to the book of the Revelation. It lays a foundation. And the question is, what are you supposed to do with the Torah? Okay? And to understand that, you have to understand, why did God give us the Torah? God didn't give us the Torah in the garden when he created man. He only gave us the Torah after 400 years of captivity in Egypt, after multiple generations. And when we left Egypt, he gave us the Torah. Why? And to understand that, we're going to start in the letter to Hebrews chapter 11. And I believe that Paul wrote this. I don't believe that Paul wrote this. I believe Luke wrote this. A lot of people think Paul wrote this, scholars. It's not signed. That's a scholarly position. They think Paul wrote it. I think it's very obvious Paul didn't write it. I think Luke wrote it. And I have my reasons, but I can't prove it. But this 11th chapter is known as the faith chapter in English. And we're talking about the Mosaic Torah, so we're going to begin in verse 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was an extraordinary child and they were not afraid of the king's decree. It's a strange thing to say, and I'm not going to break that down. Verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 25. Instead, he chose to suffer mistreatment along with the people of God rather than the pleasures of sin. Verse 26. He considered the disgrace of Messiah as greater riches than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to the reward, which is also a very interesting, deep thought, but I'm not going to break it down. Verse 27, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger, the king being Pharaoh, for he persevered as if seeing the one who is invisible. He acted like he saw the one who is invisible. And then verse 28, by faith he kept the Passover, the smearing of the blood, so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch them. In verse 29, by faith they passed through the Red Sea on dry ground. When the Egyptians tried it, they swallowed them up. So this tells the story of the Exodus and shows you step by step, it was all by faith. It was a step of faith, a step of faith, a step of faith, a step of faith, one step at a time, as he is journeying, as we journey through this world, one step at a time. You have faith, so you take a step. You have faith, so you take another step. You have faith, take another step. And Joni, I know you can't keep up with me. I'm going to just flow through the rest of these verses. Verse 4, by faith Abel offered a better sacrifice than Cain. Verse 5, by faith Enoch was taken up so he did not see death. Verse 7, by faith Noah, and it goes on to tell how he prepared the ark. In verse 8, by faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out. Verse 11, by faith Sarah herself received the ability to conceive. Verse 17, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. Verse 20, by faith Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. By faith Jacob blessed each of the sons of Joseph. And then it goes on to say by faith Joseph. And Joseph was talking about the the Exodus. You see where it says, made mention of the Exodus. Even when he went down to Egypt, he said there will be an Exodus. And gather this, you have to understand the custom, but it's gather my bones to my ancestors, which is, if you don't know what that means, ask me, I'll explain it to you. But all that is laid down as a foundation to Moses, and Moses is the key to the Mosaic Torah. And so that brings us up to verse 22, and verse 23 is what we read, and I want to go through it again because I want you to see it. By faith, Moses, when he was born for 3 months, his parents was hidden for 3 months by his parents. The 3 months is significant. The hidden is significant because they thought he was an extraordinary child, which is like, that's not what it means. Don't think Western. That's a picture. And he was not afraid of the king's decree, and the king's decree was to kill every son. By faith, in verse 24, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 25, instead, he chose to suffer mistreatment along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin. Verse 6, he considered the disgrace of Messiah as greater riches to the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to the reward. That's full of so much theology. I could talk an hour on that because it's talking about Moses, who considered the disgrace of Messiah as greater than riches of Egypt because he was looking ahead for a reward. He was looking into the future for reward. And it talks about a knowledge of the Messiah. And it talks about a knowledge of the Exodus, which is tied to the Messiah. Verse 27, by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king, Pharaoh's anger, for he perseveres as if seeing the one who is invisible. Remember, he had only talked to him in the burning bush. It's like he saw the one who is invisible, which is looking forward in this particular historical time frame to seeing God on the mountain. All right? You always look at what it's saying to you, not just what it says. Verse 7, by faith he kept the Passover, the smearing of the blood. Pesach, Passover. The smearing of blood, destroyer of the firstborn will not touch them. And finally, verse 29, passed through the Red Sea as if on dry ground. When the Egyptians tried, they were swallowed up. And it's like, it's not just that Moses had faith. Everything you do is by faith. Every step you take is by faith. Everything that you focus on can be done by faith. And I lay that down as a foundation to what I want to talk about today. And it's because of the different baggages that exist in the body of Messiah. If you're Jewish, you follow this from the perspective that God gave the Torah to us when we came out of Egypt, and he gave it to us as a people at that particular point in history. And the people that are written in the book of Moses were long dead by the time he wrote this stuff, the vast majority of them. And there are some, particularly among Gentile Christianity, who teach that God has dealt with man and his mankind in his sinful condition in different ways in different eras. They just see this is how God dealt with sin then as opposed to God dealt with sin. And they break down ages. If you've ever heard this is the church age, that's dispensationalism. It's a church age because God's doing with the church because he's done with Israel. And if you believe in a rapture, it's because God has to finish with the church age before we can deal with Israel again. So let's have a rapture and get rid of the church. All kind of theories break up. And if you're going to accept that this is the church age, then you accept the theology that is called supernomianism, but in reality it's easier to remember dispensationalism. It's this dispensation, that dispensation, another dispensation. And if you've ever heard anyone that teaches this is the church age, that pastor has been taught dispensation. And Hebrew 11 clearly shows no one in any age or dispensation was ever saved by any other means than faith. You read the Bible, there's like, now we're saved by faith. But if you read the book of Hebrews, there was never a time when God moved in any way but faith. And so when you talk about the story of the Exodus, which is leaving Egypt, it gives us what I think is a magnificent, I'm trying to think English. It's an allegory. It's a picture. It's a magnificent picture. It's an allegory of why God gave us the Torah, which is what this message is about. Why did God give us the Torah? And you see it in the Exodus. Torah also includes the giving of the Torah in the midst of the whole Exodus episode, right? Right in the middle of the book. You get into chapter 12, 13, 14. Now the giving of the Mosaic Torah is a part of the story of the Exodus. So you have the book of Exodus, you divide it in half, you're about where we got the Torah. And the story, unlike any other really pictures you have in the Bible, shows us salvation by completely unmerited favor and then obedience out of love after the grace of salvation has been received. In other words, he saved us by faith out of Egypt. He redeemed us out of Egypt by faith. And now that we have been saved or redeemed by faith, we need the Torah to live by. Okay? Because he can't give it to us while we are slaves in Egypt. He can't give it to us while we are free outside of the salvation he has for us. We must have salvation by faith. And if we have salvation by faith, now he can give us the Torah. Because we're already a redeemed people. And Exodus 12 is where we are. This is that middle point of the Exodus, where we are right in the middle of the Exodus with Machat Bakrot, the 10th plague, the slaying of the firstborn, which has to do, as most of you understand, with the priesthood. This is all about a priesthood. And if you don't understand that, ask somebody else in the congregation. I taught that last few weeks. Exodus 12, verse 1. Adonai spoke to Moshe and Aharon, Moses and Aharon, in the land of Egypt, saying, this month will mark the beginning of months for you. It'll be the first month of the year for you. That is today the month of, isn't it called Abib now? It was Abib then, it's Nisan now. Yeah, it's changed over the course of 5 centuries. So he marked the first month of the year. He didn't change the new year. He changed the first month of the year. Verse 3, tell the congregation, kahilot, ecclesia in Greek, the congregation of Israel, on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, a lamb for each household. But the household is too small for a lamb, he and his nearest neighbor are to take one according to the people, according to each person eating. You are to count the lamb. Your lamb is to be without blemish, a year-old male. You may take from the sheep, from the goats. Verse 6. You must watch over it until the 14th day of the same month. Whole assembly of Israel is to slaughter it at twilight. It's very significant terminologies. You know about the twilight, the lambs, everything centers on the land according to the people. Verse 7, they take the blood of the lamb, put it on the doorpost and the crossbeam in the house where they eat it. That's the two sides and the top. Verse 8, they shall eat it that night, roasted with fire, with matzot and bitter herbs. They shall eat it. So you have the instructions, you have bitter herbs, you have matzah, unleavened bread. You eat it that way. Verse 9, do not eat any of it raw or boiled with water, only roasted in fire. Its head, its legs, its innard, it's tied to the sacrificial system, a total dedication to God. Olah, a burnt sacrifice, which just means everything goes to God. It's complete Consummation by God. Do not let any of it remain until morning. Whatever remains in the morning, you're to burn in the fire. Verse 11, you also eat it this way, because the Exodus is about to happen. With your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand, you are to eat it. It is Adonai's Pesach. It is Adonai's Passover. It's the Lord's Passover. It's not the Jewish Passover. It's not Israel's Passover. It is Adonai's Passover. And that's one of two appointed times that now exists before the Torah is going to be given. The first one is Shabbat, which God created in the creation, the story of creation, the seventh day. God rested. It's God's Shabbat. It's the seventh day. It's not the seventh day of the week. It's the seventh day of the week, excuse me. It's not the first day of the week. It's always Shabbat. And Passover, Pesach. Those two exist before we got the Torah. And those two are tied to the Torah. Verse 12, for I will go through the land of Egypt on that night and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals. I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. I am Adonai. God is the angel of death. The angel of death is not the enemy running around killing people. The angel of death is God. Verse 12, the blood will be a sign for you, not a sign for me. It'll be a sign for you on the houses where you are. When I see the blood, I will Pesach. I will pass over you. There will be no plague among you to destroy when I strike the land of Egypt. As I've told you before, this has to do with the Egyptians a lot more than the Jewish people, because this is the land of Egypt, not the land of Goshen. Verse 14, this day will be a memorial for you. You are to keep it as a feast to Adonai. You are to keep it as a feast to Adonai throughout your generations. Keep it as an eternal ordinance. Just like Shabbat, Passover, it's an eternal ordinance. The first day is to be a holy assembly for you, as well as the seventh day. No manner of works to be done in those days except what is eaten by you in person. That alone may be prepared for you. Verse 17, so that you are to observe the feast of Matzot. For on this very day I brought you by ranks, your ranks, out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you are to observe this day throughout your generations as an eternal ordinance. The same terminology he's going to give in the 23rd chapter of Vayikra, of Leviticus, which is the calendar of God. It's the same terminology. But just like Shabbat, this predated the Torah. This predated the book of Vayikra, Leviticus. At this point in time, there is no priesthood, although the firstborn are supposed to be the priesthood. All right? And then it continues on in the story, which is chapter 12, beginning in verse 21. Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, go select lambs by your families and slaughter the Passover lamb, a very specific lamb, the Pesach lamb, the Pesach, Passover. Verse 22, you're to bundle the hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, because the blood contains the soul, and apply the crossbeam and two doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. None of you may go out of your house until evening. Don't go out of your house. This is about God's Adonai's Pesach, the Lord's Passover. Verse 23, Adonai will pass through you to strike down the Egyptians. But when he sees the blood on the crossbeam and on two doorposts, God will pass over that door. He will not allow destroyer to come to your house and strike you down. And look at the terminology. He will pass through and strike down the Egyptians. But when he sees the blood on the crossbeam and two doorposts. See, I say these things. I know what I'm talking about. The blood on the doorpost wasn't for the Jewish community. We all lived in the land of Goshen. The other 9 plagues, God knew where we were. But the 10th plague, we had to have the blood on the beams. But that wasn't for us. That was for the Egyptians. And because God cares about the Egyptians too. And so who's he going to kill? Firstborn, the priesthood of the Egyptians. Okay? Now it explains this is what happened. And you go down to verse 28. Then B'nai, the sons or the children of Israel, went and did it. They did just as Adonai had commanded Moses. Verse 29, so about midnight, at midnight, Adonai struck down the firstborn in the land of Egypt. Firstborn priesthood in the land of Egypt. This is among the Egyptians. From the firstborn of Pharaoh sitting on his throne to the firstborn captive in the dungeon, all the firstborn cattle, Verse 30, then Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and his servants and all the Egyptians. There was a loud wailing in Egypt. There was not a house where somebody was not dead. Verse 31, so he called to Moses and Aaron and said, rise, go out from my people. Go out. There's that go, go, go. That's what we call our go team, right? This congregation. Go out. Go out. But bless me too. Verse 33, and now the Egyptians urged the people, sending them out of the land quickly, for they thought, we'll all be dead. Verse 34, so the people took their dough before it was leavened with their kneading bowls, bound up their clothes on their shoulders. So Bnei Israel acted according to the words of Moses. They asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, and Adonai gave them to the people in the eyes of the Egyptians. They gave them favor in the eyes of Egyptians and let them have what they asked for. So they plundered the Egyptians. And so now they are a redeemed people. Pharaoh said, get out of here. Remember, the word of the Lord said, let my people go. And after the 10 plagues judging the gods of Egypt, Pharaoh said, get out of here. No more let my people go. You get out of here. Get out of here. And how were they redeemed? They were redeemed as a people. As a people. And you have to understand, we were not a people before the redemption. We only became a people after the redemption. Prior to that, we were the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we ended up in Egypt. Joseph, of course, is a big part of that story. In the beginnings of that story, we became a group of slaves, except for the house of Moses, who was a prince of Egypt. But now we come out of Egypt, but we're not coming out as simply the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We are coming out a mixed multitude because all the Egyptians that put the blood on their home because they bought into our God, whether one of the Egyptian gods, came out with us. But we were redeemed. How were we redeemed? We were redeemed by the blood applied to protect the priesthood, the firstborn. Okay, now, chapter 14, we're still walking through the Exodus. We're talking about why did God give us, this is all before the Torah. Remember that. We didn't get the Torah until later on in the story. Verse 14, chapter 14, verse 1, Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, speak to Bnei Israel, the sons or the children of Israel. So they turned back and encamped before Pi Ha'itrot, between Migdal and the sea. You are to camp by the sea opposite Baal Zephon. And so we're now moving, right? We are now moving. We're moving towards the land of promise. We are now moving as a redeemed people, a mixed congregation, but we are redeemed people. Verse 3. Pharaoh will say concerning Bnei Israel, they are wandering aimlessly in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. So they went out across the deserts of Egypt, and it's like they're running in. They've trapped themselves. There's nowhere for them to go. Verse 4, and God says, I will harden Pharaoh's heart so he will follow after them. Then I will be glorified over Pharaoh along with all his army, so the Egyptians will know that I am Adonai. So they did so. So he says, well, I have you as a redeemed people, but if I just take you out, Pharaoh will still be sitting in Egypt as a god because the Egyptians, Pharaoh was a god. And I've defeated the other gods of Egypt. I want the Egyptians to know that aren't coming out with us that there is a God, and the God that is the creator God is the God of Israel. So I need to give all the Egyptians a sign that they have to be careful they don't follow their God, who is Pharaoh. So I have to give the Egyptians a sign. The Egyptians a sign, so that they will know that I am Adonai. All right? There's a lot going on here. dealing with salvation, redemption. You see those shadows in there? The people are walking out their salvation, right? They're walking out their redemption. But wait a minute, don't forget the Egyptians. They need redemption. They need saved too. Got to give them a sign. Let's see where we are up there. Let's go down to verse 21. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. I'm skipping over. They've crossed. Now the Egyptians are coming. And Adonai drove the sea back with a strong east wind throughout the night and turned the sea into dry ground so the waters were divided. The Bnei Israel went in the midst of the sea on dry ground, even while the water stood like walls on the right hand, on the left side. So they're going to cross the water. It's going to go. And people say this wasn't the Red Sea. This was the Sea of Reed because it's shallow. You ever hear that story? It's shallow, and they walked across. I said, well, then there's a tremendous miracle there, too, because he drowned the Egyptian army in a shallow creek. You know, one way or the other, there's enough water to drown the Egyptians, okay? That's verse 23. When the Egyptians pursued and went in after them in the midst of the sea, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen, verse 24. Now it came about during the morning watch, Adonai looked at the army of Egyptians through the pillar of fire and cloud and caused the army of Egyptians to panic. This is centuries before you have the god Pan, by the way, whose name was given because of panic. And he caused them to panic. Verse 25, he took off their chariot wheels and caused them to drive heavily. So the Egyptians said, get away from the presence of Israel, for Adonai fights against the Egyptians. So they're chasing after them, but their wheels are falling off their chariots. So we got a problem here. Verse 26, then Adonai said to Moses, stretch out your hand over the sea, so the waters come back over the Egyptians, over their chariots and their horsemen. Verse 27, so Moses stretched out his hand over the waters. The sea returned in its strength. At the break of dawn, the Egyptians were fleeing from it. Adonai overthrew them in the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and the entire army of Pharaoh that went in after them. None of them remained, verse 29. But Bnei Israel, had walked on dry land in the midst of the sea. Somebody give me a drink of water, please. On the left. So Adonai saved Israel on that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. Look at he saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians. Look at the terminology. And Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore, verse 31. When Israel saw the great work of Adonai did over the Egyptians, the people feared God and believed in Adonai and in his servant Moses. It's like they didn't know who Moses was either, but look, obviously this guy knows God. But we are now saved where the Egyptians were not saved. So they are a saved people, right? It's very clear, even the terminology. We are saved. The Egyptians are not saved, although they have a pretty good witness. But we are saved people. We haven't been given the Torah yet, right? We don't need a Torah to get saved. We need faith to get saved, right? He can give the Torah anytime he wants. Now the people are redeemed. They are saved. And again, how are we how were we redeemed? We paid attention to God. Toda Rabbah. I appreciate it. Now I need a table. God, if I had a place to put this where it won't fall over. No, I'll just drink it. You have the blood. You have the sacrifice lamb. That's okay. I'm okay, Mitch. I can fake it. And see, what do you have in these things? You got the blood of the lamb, which has to do with the soul, and you have going through the sea. We went through the water. And we were redeemed really by the mercy of God. It's the mercy of God as we travel by faith. And you can't miss this. God redeemed us, and he explained the redemption and laid down a foundation in the slaying of a lamb and the presenting of the blood. And then he delivered us from the severe bondage of the Egyptians to the man who would not let our people go, turning around and say, get out of here. That's quite a transition. Okay? At the sea, he saved us from our oppressors, giving a witness to them that he was the true God. And God did not save us or redeem us because of our own merits. Do you understand that? It's not like we deserved it because we were a really good people sitting in the land of Goshen, worshiping the true God, praying out to him and trusting in him. We didn't have a clue. We were clueless people, and he redeemed us solely by his grace. And you have to see that, because dispensation said there's law and then there's grace. I said the law isn't here yet, and all you see is grace. The law is not going to come for some time now. But you see the grace of God all along. He rescued us from the mighty Egyptian army and destroyed their enemies, and we were not saved by our own works. It's nothing that we did. We were saved by faith. We are saved by faith because it took an act of faith on our part to believe God that He is faithful to us. And a step-by-step process as we slaughter the lamb, as we apply the blood, as we go through the water, as we do all these things, it took acts of faith, a step-by-step act of faith as you follow out what God is saying. And then we travel for 3 months through the wilderness as God is leading us on. And as He's leading us on, we are a redeemed people. We are a saved people. And we're not even on that journey doing what is pleasing to God. We're just walking by faith, kind of following God, not knowing where we're going, not knowing what He wants. But we're walking by faith, and He is saving us by grace. He's saving us by grace. Because God's the same yesterday, today, forever. You're saved today by grace. You were saved by grace at the Exodus. Frankly, we were saved by grace in the garden. In 3 months, we're traveling. A redeemed people. Following God, right? Walking by faith. And you go 3 months, you're into chapter 19 of the Exodus, which says, in the 3rd month after Bnei Israel had gone out of Egypt, the same day they arrived at the wilderness or the desert of Sinai. And then they explained where they're going in that particular area. In verse 2, they traveled from Rephidim, came up to the wilderness of Sinai, set camp in the wilderness. Israel camped there right in front of the mountain. Verse 3, so Moses went up to God, Aliyah, go up to God, and called to him on the mountain, saying, say to the house of Jacob. God called to Moses, saying, he's talking to Moses, say to this house of Jacob and tell Bnei Israel. And here's what he's saying. Verse 4, look what he says. You have seen what I have done to the Egyptians, how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. He said, tell them you're a good group of people and you're a special people and you're a unique treasure. He says, I want you to pay attention. You see what I did to the Egyptians. And I carried you out on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. A trail. Do you all know how the Ethiopians, the Beit Israel, Beit Avraham, the 2 tribes in Ethiopia, they started bringing them out? How they convinced these people to jump on an airplane and fly because they knew the Torah. God carries us on eagle's wings. They took all the seats out so they could stack more people in there. All flights. They just took out all the seats. You could really pack a lot of people. And the problem is they tried to make a fire to cook food. But it didn't bother them. They were flying because they knew that God always carries us by eagle's wings. And then they take him on a plane to fly away, and they said, oh, that's what he did for us in Egypt. See, this is part of it anyway. There's always depth to these things, and I shouldn't just talk about that because that's what I'm talking about. But he said, look, I brought you out. You see what I did to the Egyptians? I brought you out. Verse 5. Now then, you will be for me a kingdom of priests, Kohanim, and a holy nation. These are the words which you are to speak to Bnei Israel. So after all this, you see what I did to the Egyptians? I brought you out on eagle's wings. I brought you for myself. You are to be a kingdom of Kohanim. That's priesthood. Verse 6. So as for you, you will be a kingdom Kohanim and a holy nation. Verse 7. So Moses called the elders of the people, put before them these words of Adonai had commanded him, and by 8 all the people answered together, say, everything Adonai has spoken we will do. Then Moses reported the words of the people to Adonai. Follow out the journey now. We've talked about the Exodus. We're out of Egypt. We are now a redeemed people that are saved by faith, right? Through the grace of God. We have been following God for 3 months. They arrive at the mountain of God, already redeemed and saved as a people. And there are issues. We're still not a perfect people, are we? And there are these unique situations that come up because we have special circumstances and good reasons. You know, and it's a legitimate complaint. I can't drink bitter water. There's nothing to eat. You know, and then he gives us whatever, which is in Hebrew man or manna. What is that? Or in English manna, which doesn't mean anything. But manna is like, what is this? We're not perfect. We're far from perfect. We're mumbling. We're complaining. We're not satisfied. And he brings us to the mountain. But we are redeemed and a saved people because of anything we're doing or by grace. It's by grace. It's always by grace. We are redeemed and saved people because of grace, and we're not behaving the way we should be behaving because it's not about what we're doing. It's about what God did for us. It's about what he did for us. And what happens at the mountain? Jump to chapter 20, verse 1. God spoke all these words, saying, verse 2, I am Adonai, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And he said these things by carving them in stone. It's written in Hebrew here, but the vast majority don't speak Hebrew. Ani Adonai Elohechem, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt. That's the first of the 10. The 10 Commandments. Everyone's heard of the 10 Commandments. There's a Catholic 10 Commandments, there's a Protestant 10 Commandments, and there's a Jewish 10 Commandments. They all come from the same chapter, but we count them differently. We count, I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt as the first. I am Adonai, your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of God. That's the first of the 7. And Christianity changes it, and Catholicism changes it. And then it walks down these 2 tablets. No other gods before me, verse 4. Do not make yourself a graven image likeness of things in heaven above the earth or below the water. Verse 5. Do not bow down to them or let anyone serve them. For I am a jealous God, bringing iniquity of the fathers to the children, 3rd and 4th generation. That's generational curses. Verse 6, but showing loving kindness to thousands of generations who love me and keep my mitzvot. Verse 7, you do not take the name of Adonai in vain. And then the big one that finishes out the, well, I won't get into that because I'm not teaching the 10. Never mind. Remember Yom Shabbat. Remember the Shabbat. Keep it holy. You are to work 6 days, do all your work. 7 is a Shabbat. To Adonai your God, you shall not do any work, not you, your son, your daughter, your male servants, your female servants, your cattle, outsiders within your gates, and explains why. In verse 11, for in 6 days God Adonai made heaven and earth, sea, and all is in them. He blessed the Shabbat and made it holy. Verse 12, honor your father and mother so that your days may be long upon land which Adonai your God has given you. That's an important one because that's the only instruction you get with a promise tied to it. It's among them. It's a big one. And then it rounds out. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness. And then do not covet your neighbor's house or wife or maidservant or manservant, ox, donkey, anything. And then it says, how did we respond to that? All the people witnessed the thundering and the lightning as the sound of the shofar and the mountain smoking. When the people saw it, they trembled and stood alone. They said to Moses, you speak to us. We will listen. Don't let God speak to us, lest we die. So Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. Adonai, your God, has come to test you, so his fear may be upon you, his reverence may be in you, so that you do not sin. It's not enough to believe in God. You have to have reverence, and that fear has to be a part of what you are. That recognition of God has to be inside of you, or you can't walk in obedience. And the people stood far off. These are all pictures. I mean, it's historical, but picture. They're staring far. What are they staring far off from? Just standing far off from God. We don't know about this. While Moses drew near, the thick darkness of God was. Adonai said to Moses in verse 22, say this, B'nai Israel, you yourself seen that I have spoken to you from heaven. Now, this is 50 days after we crossed the river. This is 50 days after the Passover. It's this day, 50 days later, that God gave us the mandates that exist in the Torah. And what you can clearly see, we were not redeemed or saved by works of righteousness according to the Torah, because we didn't get them till 50 days later. And we didn't officially have the Torah until 50 days after we left Egypt. Till 50 days after we were redeemed, after we were slaved, after God carried us away on eagle's wings to gather us to himself. And you have to understand that if you understand why God gave us Torah. God didn't give us the Torah so we could be saved, so we could be redeemed, so we could be, do you understand? No, we were already saved and redeemed. But a saved and redeemed people needs to know how to live in a way that brings us blessing. See, he could have given us the Torah in the garden. He could have given the Torah to Abraham. He could have given it to Isaac. He could have given it to Jacob or any of the 12 sons of Jacob. He could have given it at any point in history. But if he gave the Torah before we had a people that were redeemed in his grace, to walk by faith and to become followers of him as a community, then it makes sense to give us instructions as to how we are to behave, because it deals with how we are to behave not just as individuals, but as a community. You need a community to walk in the instructions of God. As I usually say almost every Shabbat, if we didn't have people gather with us on this day, we would not be able to be obedient to God to gather on this day. So the purpose of the Torah was not so that we might be saved by it, not that we could be redeemed by it. I'm redeemed because I keep the Torah. No, I'm already saved and redeemed through faith in grace, and I walk by the mercy of God. Oh, it's the whole story of the Exodus. Therefore, the Torah was given to us because God expected his children, the community that he had saved and redeemed and led according to his own will. They needed to learn how to live by a specific moral code if they were going to stay in that body of a saved, redeemed people who are saved by faith in the mercy of God, who will walk in grace. But as we do that, how am I supposed to interact with all of you? How am I supposed to interact with the people of the world? How am I supposed to, what's my moral code? The moral code is the Torah. That's my moral code. See, that breaks down all of the worldly legal debates on when does life start, before you're born or after you're born or after you're 1 year old or after you're a teenager. And if you have consenting adults, why do you have to be married? And what difference does it make? And I'm telling you why it doesn't make, because God gave us a moral code to walk out as a redeemed people. And we're not saved as a redeemed people because we walk out what God told us to do. Because we always walk by faith. We always walk by grace and God's mercy. And as I am saved by grace, not by works. I'm saved by faith, not by works. I'm saved by God's mercy, not because I'm a Torah observant. It's because of what God has done for me. So what is the purpose of the Torah? Why did God give the Torah to this people? And it kind of comes together at the end of the book. In chapter 11 of Deuteronomy, of Devarim, Devarim words. The word Deuteronomy, I don't know what it means, but the Hebrew word is davrim, which means word. One davar, one words, one speaking, davar, words, it's a speaking thing. You have words, and it's just in a format of a ketubah, a marriage contract. These are the words that God gave us in this book. Verse 26, see, I'm setting today you a blessing and the curse. Why did he give us? Because he's giving us a chance. Choose a blessing or a curse. Just choose. I'm giving you so you know you have a choice to make. Verse 27, the blessing, if you listen to the instructions of Adonai your God that I'm commanding you today. Verse 28, but the curse if you don't listen to the mitzvot of Adonai your God, but turn away from what I'm commanding you today so that you go to other gods and make them known. So I'm setting for you a blessing, a curse. A blessing if you keep the Torah, a curse if you don't keep the Torah. But does it say you're going to be saved if you keep the Torah? Or you're not going to be saved if you don't keep the Torah? Being saved has nothing to do with the Torah. You have to see that. The Torah wasn't given, has nothing to do with my redemption, nothing to do with my salvation. Through the mercy and grace of God, I am saved and redeemed. And what he's saying is, I set before you a blessing and a curse. A curse if you're obedient, a blessing if you're obedient, a curse if you're disobedient. That's what it's about. That's what about. And now in chapter 30. Because he says, you're going to the land of promise, that's okay, you're going to sin, I'm going to throw you out into the nations. It's the scattering. These are all stuff that God gave us. Chapter 30, verse 1. Now when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse I have set upon you, and you take them to heart in all the nations where your God, Lord your God had banished you. You're going to be banished, you're going to go out from the land of promise, which is the same thing. It's all pictures, right? Go out of the land of Egypt, go out of the land and there's always going out, but we're going out of the land in chapter 30 of Deuteronomy, not because we have lost our redemption or our salvation, because we have chosen a curse. And so we go out in the nations, and we could still be a redeemed, saved people out in the nations, because it has nothing to do with whether or not I keep the Torah. It has to do with God's mercy and favor and love for me. And now I get to choose to have a blessing in my life. I get to choose to have life, not eternal life, but a blessing in life, rather than a curse and death. Because I'm going to send you out. Where am I at? I'm in verse 1. Verse 2. And there, when you're out here in diaspora, and you return, Jews return, Christians repent. Okay, it's a direction. It's teshuvah. Jews return, Christians repent. Sin, falling short of God, is a direction rather than an act. You're either moving towards God or away from God. Christians think it's what you do and what you don't do. And Jews think it's you're either moving toward God or you're moving away from God. If you're moving away from God, you need to return to God. Gentiles need to turn to God, which is repentance, but it has nothing to do, never, anyway. I digress. Listen to his voice. According to all I'm commanded you and your children with all your heart and with all your soul. God is serious about this stuff. When I curse you because you chose the curse, verse 3, then Adonai your God will bring you back. Bring you back. You see all these motions. Hebrew is based in verbs. English is based in nouns. Hebrew's based in verbs. I'll send you out, I'll bring you back. It's an activity. And have compassion on you. And he will return and gather you from all the peoples where Adonai your God has scattered you. Verse 4. Even if you're outcast or at the ends of the heavens, there your God will gather you from there, and he will bring you. Adonai your God will bring you into the land your fathers possessed, and you will possess it, and he will do good and multiply you and all your fathers. Also in verse 6, Adonai will circumcise your heart and circumcision of your descendants to love God with all your heart, soul, in order that you may live. Now this is do you understand? The Torah was given 50 days after we were already a saved and redeemed people. We had sacrificed a lamb, we had applied the blood, we had gone through the water, we journeyed through, we were actually in the middle of the journey through the wilderness, and God is already talking, by the way, you're going to get to the land of promise, and you're not going to pay attention to the moral laws I'm setting before you right now, and I'm telling you, you're going to go out, and you're going to be dispersed all the way to Bradenton, and when you're there and you remember God, then you can start coming back. You come back to God. Coming back to God does not mean solely coming back to the land of promise, which he did promise us, and it's a part of our heritage. It means coming back to God as a redeemed people who are walking through the grace and mercy of God by faith and choosing to live a life that brings us life and blessing rather than a cursing and rather than spiritual death. And then you'll get it, because although circumcision predates the Torah, circumcision is a part of the Torah. But what we're talking about is not the circumcision he gave to our father Abraham. This is a circumcision that goes to your heart. This is circumcision that goes to your heart. God wants to circumcise your heart so you can be wholehearted towards him. You see, I don't have to have my heart circumcised to be saved and redeemed. Once I'm saved and redeemed, I need my heart circumcised so I can walk according to the moral structure that God gave me in the Torah. The Torah was given to give a redeemed people who were saved by the grace and mercy of God a way to live a moral life that brings us blessing and not a curse. Because I could choose the curse and it will not cost me my salvation. Do you understand? I could eat all the swine I want and I could desecrate the Shabbat. That will not cost me my salvation, because I am not saved because I eat according to the Bible. It's just I'm not choosing a curse. So the Torah was given so that a redeemed, saved people who walk in the mercy and grace of God know how to live a moral life that brings blessing into my life. And see, that's what I want. I want a blessed life. I want a blessed life. I don't do the Torah because I'm more saved. And Paul said, look, if you're going to do the Torah thinking that will save you, you're in trouble. Because that's death. You're choosing a death. Because I'm saying if I keep the Torah, I'm saved. Well, now you're rejecting the blood of the Lamb and the passing the water. You're rejecting what God has done for you, and it's about what you can do for yourself. Hey, that's death. It's death when you think you can do it yourself. You always, from the Garden of Eden all the way to the book of the Revelation of Yeshua Messiah, we walk by faith as a people who are redeemed and saved by God's mercy in giving us what we need to cover us from the angel of death. It has to do with the sacrifice of the Lamb and the blood of the Lamb, which contains the soul. Most of you understand these things. And he says, in the end, he'll circumcise our heart, not only us, but the descendants, to love Adonai God with all your heart and all your soul in order that you may live. Because if you're not working according to my moral instructions, you're dead already. So you must be born again to get the eternal life. The Torah never, ever, ever had anything to do with our salvation. The Torah has to do with the people that have salvation that God gives us in his grace and mercy. So you start with that foundation. Because a lot of people don't know what to do with the Torah. Because they think the Torah was given before there was grace and salvation. I said, no, you can't give people a way to live morally when they don't have salvation, because there's no good reason to do it. People don't sin because they're evil. They sin because sin is fun. It feeds my flesh. It feeds the world. And it's easier to be evil in this world because if you're good, people think you're weird. So why was the Torah given? Because a saved and redeemed people who are walking by faith in the grace of God need to choose to walk a life that is blessed and filled with life and blessing because they keep the Torah of God, because it is something they do in their heart and not because we have to. It's because we get to. We get to choose it so that you will live. So that you will live. Well, that's not eternal life, because eternal life comes through God. This is life, a good life. I want a good life. I want the best life I can get. I care about politics because I want a good life. Although I don't count on any political person to do anything for me. I want good politicians so that my life can be as blessed as it conceivably be, because sometimes Caesar behaves like Caesar. In every year, in every place. What is the bottom line? Why did God give us the Torah? Because a saved, redeemed people walking in the grace of God by faith need some instructions on how we're supposed to do things now that we are saved people who are saved in faith, by faith, through faith, in the grace and mercy of God, have some idea how are we supposed to behave. Easy, look at the Torah. That's how you're supposed to behave, and that's why the Torah is given. So be blessed, everybody. Just a reminder, I appreciate you being here, but a week from tomorrow is the first picnic. Wednesday morning, we're going to set up the picnic ground to have our first picnic next week. May God bless you and keep you, make his face shine upon you, be gracious unto you, lift up his countenance upon you, and grant you his peace. Enjoy Oneg. Be blessed, everybody. I'll gather the board of directors after you have a little bit.